Welcome to Pure Nonfiction, the podcast interviewing documentary filmmakers. I'm Tom Powers, the documentary programmer for the Toronto International Film Festival and artistic director of Doc NYC. On this episode, I speak with Maxim Pozdorovkin, who's made several films set in Russia. The best known is Pussy Riot, a punk prayer, about the dissident performers who went on trial. Maxim's latest documentary, Our New President, looks at the election of Donald Trump through the lens of Russian media coverage. The film also chronicles the increasing state influence on Russian television.
The Kremlin take over Russia's last independent television network. Many here fear it marks the beginning of the end of Russian democracy.
Our New President started as a short film for Field of Vision, the company led by Laura Poitras, and you can watch that version for free online. Maxim expanded it to a 70-minute version that is now touring film festivals and will be released later this year. We sat down in March when I hosted the film at the Miami Film Festival. Maxim begins by describing his own journey from Russia to America.
I was born in Moscow, and when I was about 10 years old in 91, my mom got a job to work at the UN, and she did women's reproductive health in the developing world. And so we came over thinking that we were coming over for about 2 years, but then that job got extended, so we stayed. We sort of stayed, and then the Soviet Union collapsed. So it was very strange because we left in February of 91, and then everything. And strangely, everything, the coup took place on my mom's birthday on August 19th, 1991, 6 months later.
Uh-huh.
But my mom really loved her job, and so we just continued and kind of lived
so
here.
So you weren't a family necessarily fleeing
No.
the Soviet
It was
Union.
It was strange. Yeah, my mom was one of the first kind of people who was, she was just a researcher. I mean, but who was hired out of the Soviet Union before it collapsed, and it was sort of a miracle that she got the job in the first place.
And so you came of age in the United States, and at what point did you start thinking about doing work in Russia?
Well, I think what happened was because kind of Russian culture and living in Russia was something that was taken away from me. It was always important for me to preserve it. So I think even in university and when I started to kind of fall in love with film, and then also in grad school, I just always wanted to have it be a part of my life. So I was always interested in it, and kind of inevitably some creative endeavors led me there. And then, I ended up making these films there. So for me, it was kind of, I didn't want to lose it entirely because I had seen so many kind of immigrants that came to America about the same time that I did. And, they lose the language, they lose a lot of that ability. So for me, I wanted to kind of, to live here and build my life here, but I kind of wanted to remain in touch and have contacts there and work with people there.
Maxim's breakthrough film, directed in collaboration with Mike Lerner, was Pussy Riot, a punk prayer, in 2013. The punk art group Pussy Riot was a collective of women who staged guerrilla performances with anti-Putin lyrics. They were visually striking for their brightly colored ski masks, dresses, and tights. In 2012, 3 members were arrested on charges of hooliganism for performing in Moscow's Orthodox Cathedral. Maxim's film follows their trial. He describes how he first learned of the group.
I guess I became aware of Pussy Riot with the Red Square action. And I just loved the fact that to me, felt like that they were this continuation of Moscow conceptualism and kind of punk rock, and performance art coming out of a sort of DIY tradition. And I think that especially in the Russian media sphere, that felt so exciting because there was always this marginal space of dissident artists. But the sort of the dominant mainstream sort of the culture dictated by television is so dominant that it's really hard to find those alternatives. So immediately, like, I was excited by the possibility of sort of young people in Russia who are into the kind of similar things that I was into, and so I wanted to sort of to know more. And I happened to be in Moscow during their trial. And so I went
coincidentally.
I was producing I was kind of pre-producing a different film. I did a film called The Notorious Mr. Boot, and while I was there, my dad went to the summer house. I didn't want to go to the summer house, and so I stayed in Moscow. And then I had a press credential, and then I went to the trial, and I started attending it. And I was fascinated by the fact that the trial was filmed, and it seemed to be filmed from different angles because I think they had requested a motion for the trial to be filmed, and it was granted.
This is being filmed by outside media or by a court?
It was being filmed by this organization, and this story will actually tie into our new president in a certain way. It was being filmed by a news agency called Riot Novosti, which is sort of a Russian equivalent of Reuters or Associated Press. And the thing about Riot Novosti at the time was that they were somewhat independent. Because they didn't aspire to the status of sort of elite television media. They sort of just did, the legal reporting, a lot of the dry reporting. And they were allowed to function somewhat independently. And so I was able to license a lot of the footage for that film. The heart of that film, when I was watching the trial, I was like, this is so fascinating that this is being prosecuted. Like the idea of this sort of show trial playing out in a legal context with witnesses and offended parties and all these things is so fascinating that, I wanted to work with this material. So I reached out and I was able to license that trial material, and I wanted to build a film around it. At the very end of the process of cutting that film and ending that film, it was announced that Dmitry Kiselyov, who's now sort of the head of all Russian media, and he's the most popular news host in Russia, that all the media agencies, all the sort of Riot Novosti and a lot of these kind of were being consolidated into one giant entity called Russia Today, which is not RT. It's a slightly different entity. It's not the green label. It's called Russia Today, Россия сегодня, and this sort of blowhard Sean Hannity-like guy was being put in charge of all of it. So I realized that. And we quickly kind of finished all the paperwork and were able to license that footage in time. I've spoken to people who tried to license and access that footage later on, and they were given a sort of, they were not allowed to do it. And this was, literally a matter of weeks.
Wow. So this is it's in 2013 when you were doing that?
Yeah, this was end of 2013, right at the trial.
So you described being fascinated watching the trial. Where did you, as you were watching the trial, where did you think it was headed?
It was a tough thing because I was around and I was filming with a lot of the activists. And so when you're filming with activists, there's a certain kind of constant state of hyperbole around. So there was constant this sense that they were going down and that they were going down for 7 years. And so that was sort of my immediate reality while making the film. And so then you kind of end up, it's almost like watching a sports match that's unpredictable because you sort of end up rooting for the underdog and for the faint possibility that, let's say, Western media attention or any of these other factors would swing it in some way, and maybe it did, maybe it didn't. They ended up getting 2 years and then were let go a few months early.
That leads me to ask, you say that you're kind of surrounded by an activist community. Do you feel like you were part of that activist community? Did you feel like you were kind of working on behalf of Pussy Riot?
Well, see, that's my kind of temperament is not that of an activist. I think I'm much more of an observer. And being around it, I had sort of this formally, and in terms of the storytelling, I had this choice. Well, I knew that the majority of the film I wanted to be about the three main girls who were on trial and their statements, so I wanted to build the film around there. And I had room for effectively one parallel storyline. And I had a choice in the material that we had between making that storyline about activists and then making it about these Orthodox, they're sort of like biker priests. For people who have seen the movie, they'll remember that turn into, they're sort of a bizarro world Pussy Riot, in that they stage all these as sort of holy acts and burn posters of Madonna and do these absurd things. And so I had this choice of whether that second parallel storyline should be about, and that choice came down to interpreting whether Pussy Riot was sort of the end, was sort of a new stage of a resurgent protest movement, or whether they were sort of the last dying embers of a protest movement that started in response to the parliamentary elections and the massive fraud and all those things. And my intuition at the moment was that actually it was the latter, that these kinds of conservative, radical, nationalistic voices were actually becoming more prominent around this time. And in many ways, Pussy Riot, they didn't obviously trigger it. They were used in this, but the patriarch and Putin and a lot of people used it to ramp up the moralistic, nationalistic fervor, which then naturally continued into Ukraine and everything else. So that was sort of so I didn't.
And looking back, you feel like that's what happened.
Yeah, and I feel like that was actually kind of historically, because a lot of times when you're making these movies in the moment about what's happening in movies about politics, you do have to kind of make these interpretive gestures, and I think that one is one that we got right in the sense that that's basically what happened. But coming back to your question, being in the activist midst, first of all, it's very hard to not be swayed by that energy because it's very exciting and it's also sort of earnest, and so much of kind of documentary feeds on that kind of energy.
Well, I mean, also the members of Pussy Riot themselves who are on trial are inspiring women. I mean, exactly. Incredibly brave, incredibly eloquent. The more you get to know about them, the more impressive they seem. In fact, I think when I first encountered them just as images on TV and like this kind of, punk rock look about them, I didn't realize how much depth there was to that.
And I think that a lot of that was actually created by the fact that the media coverage, it sort of both played to their favor and it was a sort of a disservice simultaneously. The fact that they were covered primarily as musicians kind of downplayed them because it trivialized them, making them sort of these, punk rock girls that just wanted to do something punk for the fuck of it, and they were both so well educated and so thoughtful about the stuff that they were doing, and they really saw themselves as part of an artistic tradition. And I think that and that really came out in the trial, and that's what was also so fascinating, the way it tapped into the history of all these kinds of dissident trials throughout, from Stalin's period up through the 60s and 70s with a lot of the dissident writers from that time.
So not long after the film was finished, they were finally let out of jail a few months short of their 2-year sentence in the lead up to the Sochi Olympics. So the perception is that they were being let out to kind of clean up the image of Russia. I remember reading that you had gone over there to do a screening with them after they had been let out of jail and met some resistance to that screening happening. Can you describe what happened?
Yeah. So right after Nadia and Masha returned to Moscow from their places of imprisonment, the Gogol Center, which is an independent kind of radical theater, it's one of the kind of more radical theaters in Moscow, decided to put on a screening of the film with me and Nadia and Masha present. So I arrived in Moscow on Friday night, and for the first time I met these people with whom I had effectively spent a year and a half making this movie, watching them, and I had had very little contact with them before. And then that night, on Friday, there was, via Facebook, an official ban for this screening. An interesting side note about the Gogol...
So the state of Russia issued an official ban?
It wasn't the Minister of Culture, it was sort of the second minister. He's the Minister of Culture effectively for the city of Moscow. I don't know how to translate his title exactly. He officially banned via Facebook the event, and he reached out to the artistic director of the theater, who's a guy named Kirill Serebrennikov, who's a fairly well-known theater director and film director who's now on house arrest for embezzlement because he's staged a lot of provocative shows with gay themes and direct. And so he was told to ban. He was privately told to ban the screening. He then went and publicly posted on Facebook a note saying that I'll only do it if I have it in writing. In other words, if it's officially banned. That night, Friday night, the Moscow Minister of Culture writes on Facebook, "You'll have your paper." And then there was a paper issued which sort of stated that but the film did not ameliorate society in any kind of productive way. So it was a kind of beautiful artifact of bureaucratic repression. So that screening was canceled, but then it's been fascinating to observe how even Serebrennikov, who was sort of a darling who is a darling of a kind of a progressive Moscow culture, has also been stigmatized and now arrested. So,
was the film able to be spread just through kind of BitTorrent means or DVD samizdat or?
Yeah, I think that's the thing is obviously all these gestures, and I think that at a certain point they also must realize it, are self-defeating because, I think shortly after the film was on HBO, it was on YouTube, on basically YouTube with a Russian title. And and then hundreds of thousands of people watched it that way. So and then it was always on all the Russian torrents and a lot of sites. I think in the Russian social media site VKontakte, people found it. So obviously it only because immediately it was a news story, and so I think it only fanned the flames to a certain extent.
So, what was it like to be meeting these people with whom you had spent several months documenting their story? Your film was, one of the major touch points for anyone who wanted to learn that story. It feels to me like there must be a great sensitivity to encountering them.
Well, I think, I've had this conversation with many documentarians, and there's this, it's very hard to describe the nature of a surreal moment when you've sort of, having worked on the film and edited, like there were phrases that I knew and their intonations that I knew so precisely that when you meet this person, you have this bizarre sense that they're going off script, that they're not using the words that you know them to say. So it's almost like they have this limited vocabulary of the 3 hours of footage that I have. And when you meet a person that you've spent that much time via their footage in real life, and they're slightly different and they deviate, you're just put in this, as a filmmaker, you're just put into this baffled state of just kind of observing it from a side. And that naturally sort of matched their state because they had just come out of severe women's prisons to hundreds of paparazzi. Right. It was that kind of transition. I mean, I guess they knew about it a little bit that the trial was covered, but actually being free and being surrounded by this kind of maelstrom of publicity was also, I've talked to them since about it, but, it was also kind of absolutely maddening for them.
And where is the Pussy Riot group today?
I think that they're all basically pursuing different projects. Nadia, I saw her not too long ago in LA. She's mostly doing music stuff. She's collaborating with a lot with Dave Sitek from TV on the Radio, and so she did a video about Trump as well. She's done a few political videos, and she's moved kind of in a stylized kind of pop star direction, like a political pop star direction. Masha has been working with the Belarus Free Theater and doing a version of her book as a kind of multimedia theater performance. And she's also played in one of their pieces, and they're touring around with that a bit. And,
Well, Pussy Riot, as I understand it, it's a bit amorphous. I mean, there are the three women in your film who got prosecuted, but there were lots of other members of that group, and it seemed to me like it was a little bit intentional to to let it be a loose collective. I've just been interested in art collectives for a long time, and what's funny is that in almost everyone that I've come across, everyone that has this gesture of radical inclusivity as its founding, as Pussy Riot did, as Vaina, the group that preceded them, did,
always kind of succumb to these radical hierarchies and stuff. But yes, but Pussy Riot was founded as the whole idea behind the masks was that it was a kind of anonymity where they would be able to, where anyone could take on that identity and kind of push forward those ideals in politics.
So, having made this film that was banned in a sense, did it make it more difficult for you to do work in Russia?
No, not really. Almost after every screening, both with Our New President and with Pussy Riot, I would always get the question of whether I felt, it's a kind of standard documentary question of whether you feel safe going back to the country. And the thing that I always say is that the thing about kind of autocratic governments is that they're repressive in unsystematic ways. And that's the point, that that it's not actually a predictable pattern of behavior, a pattern of punishment, because that kind of creates the climate of self-censorship. And that's a very real kind of effect of control. So, no, I have family there. My dad is there. So I've gone back and, I've made movies there. So nothing has happened. I don't know if that will continue to be the case. But I just know how foolhardy it is to try to be predictive or with these kinds of things, because that's precisely the point of how these kinds of regimes work.
Maxim's new project, Our New President, takes a different approach from his earlier work. The film is largely constructed with clips from Russian television covering the U.S. presidential election. They range from cartoon crazy to seemingly credible. The station Russia Today has a broadcast stream in English, and its segments spread via YouTube, Facebook, and other platforms. The slick production values might be mistaken for CNN or BBC, but the content skews in another direction.
What has been the biggest scandal in the UK since World War II has now come to the U.S., and it may involve former President Bill Clinton. As the story grows, it becomes more and more apparent this is not just a story of underage girls. It is the story of a massive pedophilia ring involving some of the most powerful people in the world.
Maxim describes how he got started on Our New President.
Well, this project came about in two ways. There was two moments. First, there was Trump's election, which is sort of the obvious one. And I had this, I think as kind of probably many filmmakers did, I had this question of, okay, how do you do this person that's so exposed and has been examined from every conceivable angle? How do you do something about what the situation that we find ourselves in that's different and at least tries to approach it from a different angle? Because obviously I think that the earnest angle, the sort of earnest investigative angle, hasn't necessarily worked and probably contributed to his rise and his media personality. And so I kept thinking, it was like, how do you do something about that? And at the same time, our editor, Matvey Kulakov, came back from visiting his mom in Russia several weeks after Trump's victory. And at this point, there was kind of talk of Russia, but it was very, very faint. None of the stuff that we know had come out yet. And so he comes back and he goes, he's very laconic. He goes, everyone's very excited about Trump. They keep on calling him our new president, our new president. So we decided, we're like, wow, this is interesting. And I had actually, since working on the Pussy Riot film.
Can you elaborate what people meant by that?
Well, they meant a lot of things, and it sort of became the film, that they thought that he was, they were consuming a news diet that immediately started feeding them the fact that it was created, that it was sort of elections were fixed by themselves, and they were touting the influence themselves. So, a lot of times when people watch the film, they'll say that they feel ridiculous about the length of how many months there were these articles going. It's like, well, is there evidence? Did they not? Because here, as we show in the film, people are sort of gloating about it immediately. So we decided, okay, let's investigate this phenomenon. And I've always been interested in the way that disinformation and propaganda travels. And even in the Pussy Riot film, I used this montage of federal television in Russia, because I've always felt, even dealing with my relatives, what a truly, truly corrosive force these kinds of major networks are on Russia, on people's kind of political consciousness, on kind of even their moral state, not to sound righteous about it. But and so So I was always fascinated by this, and we started digging for basically pieces of disinformation about the American campaign and the way that disinformation was kind of regurgitated throughout. And we wanted to see, can you make a movie effectively out of factual television and informational programming without a single true statement? Because it felt like conceptually, if you could do that or even approach to do that, that says something profound about the sort of a media landscape that we find ourselves in. And the idea was also, okay, fake news, this thing exists. We know that it's a problem. How do you make people actually feel something about it? You can read about it, you can see a meme that's false, that's making fun of Hillary, but how do you actually feel something about this reality and that's what we tried to do. And one of the things that we learned in the process of gathering this information and kind of and storytelling is that propaganda today is as much about disorientation as disinformation. It's creating, and this is what I think that we learned as we were gathering the material, but that's also what's come out in the troll investigation. That's really about turning the internet into this kind of garbage dump of information where people just give up on the activity of even trying to figure out what's true. They kind of, as Adam Curtis describes it, they sort of throw their hands up and go, oh dear, and kind of just give up on that process.
I want to ask you this about the way Russians are consuming media. I had a perception during the days of the Soviet Union when the newspaper Pravda was the main state organ that Russians had grown up to naturally distrust what they read in Pravda. And I wonder today when you describe that they take in a diet that it seems like a majority of Russians accept that narrative. How does that track historically? For a country that for many years was taught to distrust the official state media, is it a difference that they accept what they watch now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's exactly this question is exactly why I wanted to make this into a film, let's say, rather than writing something about it. Or it's completely true that Russians living there, that there's this kind of much written about doublethink that a lot of times that Soviet people, where they basically had to accept a certain reality, they knew that it was false, and then they had a kind of a parallel reality. So there was this kind of double consciousness that was always at play. And part of that was this pathological distrust of management, of all sorts of authority, and that included the sort of official newspaper. At the same time, what was interesting was that in the Soviet Union, in terms of visual literacy and in terms of media literacy, when you're consuming it through visual means, the techniques were actually quite primitive if you look at sort of Soviet news. What happens in 91 is that the influence of sort of cable news and kind of an infotainment and that model comes in full force, it's adapted, it's taken in. The difference is that once Putin consolidates the media, they get a clear directive of how they're supposed to interpret given events. And then they use essentially the same techniques that they learn, editing techniques that they see in Western media to sort of manipulate that reality, except they're willing to go to a degree of outright fabrication. And that's sort of what feels different than even something like Fox News. Mm-hmm. So what I've found is that Russians who consume, because television is basically free in Russia, these major channels, they consume an enormous amount of it, and they're, I found, incredibly gullible to the visual means that are used. And then the other point to be made is that, returning to this earlier thing I said about disorientation and the way it works, is actually if you create a population, and this is what we tried to do in the film, because the film is ultimately, Russian propaganda is not as crazy as we make it seem. This is a distillation of it, of those techniques, so to focus people's attention on them. We want the film to be slightly a dystopian vision of this, precisely because when you have a fully disoriented public, they're much more gullible already to begin with, because the notion of truth has become so fluid that it doesn't matter. There's this moment in the film that I really like and that I always talk about where a woman introduces Trump as a troubled teenager from Brooklyn, right? And you think about that, why would you why would you do that? It's not clearly pro-Russian. It's not really like, why make that mistake? It's, people have the internet. It's not that hard to do. And the whole point is precisely one of the traits of the kind of propaganda and how it works is that it's internally inconsistent, and that's the point. It's high volume, it's multiple channel, and it's internally inconsistent because then people just stop even trying to make sense of it. They kind of just believe it, and they use it as fodder for their own righteousness, for their own argumentation, for talking about the world, but they give up on that analytic process entirely. And that's the real tragedy of all of this, and that's what we tried to capture. And I think that goes back, that gullibility was sort of brought on with the new media model that came in 91.
Well, I mean, it's striking to me because before watching Our New President, I hadn't taken in that much or any really of like the Russia Today channel. And one thing that struck me was the aesthetics of it, and that it was packaged in this sophisticated way that sort of connotes credibility.
Exactly.
When I think of traditional Soviet television, I think of like a guy sitting behind a desk with low production values, reading something off of a piece of paper. I don't know even know if that's an accurate representation or not, but that's kind of my, archetypal impression. And that has a look that, there's no way I'm going to believe that guy reading paper. But when you turn it into a Western-looking news set with flashy graphics and, designer suits, it automatically gains this extra credibility.
Yeah. You hit the nail on the head in terms of what is, to my mind, the single most untalked about aspect of sort of a Russian troll farm investigation and what's happened with it. And here's why. There's one factor to all the things that you just said about RT. There's one factor that needs to be added, is that they give away this content that has clear production value, as you're talking about, and make it clearly available on YouTube for free in high quality content. You can just download it. They have a license that they give it away. You don't have to pay for it. And that essentially becomes the fodder for so much of material because it has production values and it can be reused. There's this statistic that they've always used that I've never quite understood, and Putin himself says it in the movie at the 10-year anniversary of RT. He says that we're the number one TV channel in terms of YouTube views. So it's sort of like, and they have a number that's it's several billion. And I've never understood, it's a little bit of a nonsensical statement, so I thought it was just, like blurbies. But I think that what it means is that unlike a lot of TV networks that tend to stay proprietary with their streaming services, Russia Today puts everything on YouTube in good quality. And then a lot of what the troll farm actually does is take this material that, again, has some kind of credibility, if only aesthetically, and then repackage it many, many times with new and more ridiculous headlines. And that's how the material really travels. And very few of those will get that many hits, but eventually they'll get a hit. And the whole point of how advertising revenue works on the internet is that novelty and new content that's created and uploaded has a chance of competing with entrenched sources like real news sources, New York Times or BBC or what have you. And that's effectively what the troll farm was gaming. And no one is talking about this in a way because there's no way to really restructure the internet revenue structure by Facebook or Google or any of these to get rid of it. Like, they used it exactly how it's supposed to be used. They just intuited that. And this is why the film effectively connects kind of old television media and the new sort of what I call 21st century propaganda, which is kind of the things of troll farm, because they essentially provide the fodder, the raw material to create these memes, to repackage it. And a lot of times what you notice, actually, and when we were digging and finding all these plausibly newsy YouTube channels like called News from the Truth and things like that, is that a lot of times the headlines didn't have anything to do even with the embedded video and the report that was in it, or it had very, very faint connection. But the whole point is that it doesn't matter, is that it travels as a headline with a picture. And as long as that picture has some
shows up in a Google search.
Yep.
Our New President begins with a story about Hillary Clinton that dates back to 1997, when her husband was president, before the world had heard of Monica Lewinsky. The First Lady was visiting the Siberian city of Novosibirsk, and she stopped to see a recently excavated mummy. Locals thought the mummy had a curse. Years later, when Hillary Clinton was running for president, a Russian TV report theorized that she was cursed by the mummy.
Хиллари Клинтон. После встречи с принцессой начались проблемы посерьезней. Муж Билл завел роман с практиканткой Моникой Левински.
Maxim explains this bizarre footage.
You know, when we started making Our New President, we made it first as a short for Field of Vision, and that was about Trump winning and Russia's reaction. So it was a kind of in-the-moment thing, and we released it shortly after we made it. And then the Russia story continued unfolding, and so we continued to make this film. And the first thing we realized we had to do is go back and look at the actual campaign and what was happening. And what we realized was that while Trump was was discussed very little during the campaign, or much less than you would expect, the denigration of Hillary was so profound and so complete and so thorough, as well as the kind of the disparagement of American democracy and the institution of election. Is almost preparing for if Trump were not to accept the results had he lost, for what would happen. And one of the things that we found initially was this theory, which was presented as a news report, that when Hillary Clinton was First Lady, and this is true, she went to Novosibirsk, and there she went to visit this mummy that had been dug up, who was called the princess. And the locals had apparently said that she should be buried back, or anyone that comes into contact with her will be cursed. And the argument was that immediately after visiting the mummy, all of Hillary's problems began. Monica Lewinsky stepped into her life. Soon after, her mental illness, her health problems began making themselves known. And there was a sort of theory about Hillary's inadequacy as a candidate built on the story of the mummy. So we decided that, partly it's almost just showbiz that if you have a mummy in your movie, you have to start it. But you have to lead with it. But the other thing is that this is a movie that that we wanted the audience to have some kind of buy-in at the very beginning. So the film opens with this kind of John Carpenter-esque sequence that we found in these regional archives. So we got it from the regional archives of the actual mummy being excavated, and then we got the original footage of Hillary Clinton visiting the mummy, because we wanted that opening precisely for its disorienting effect, for no one to know what the hell is going on. And that acts effectively as a sort of buy-in into the story. And then you start to see the kind of insane news footage and its regurgitation across the internet. And so that was the idea, and there's a reveal at the end that we won't give away.
I want to ask you about the process of compiling all this footage. I was just reading a book that's an oral history of The Daily Show, and they talk about the way over the years The Daily Show, changing technology made them more and more efficient at being able to gather clips from Fox News or CNN and reinterpret it for their show. And that was fascinating that, at some point they just had multiple DVRs running, hoovering up all the news that was going on. What was your process for accumulating all the footage that you use?
We had a whole group of researchers, and we had this idea. So we were also hoovering all this news. We had this idea that the film should be structured about basically be made primarily of 3 channels. So Russia 1, which is the most popular channel in Russia, Russia Today, which is RT, which is the English language channel, and then NTV, which was a formerly independent, now party line channel. So we were gathering all these shows.
And so just to be clear here, are these channels literally state-run or?
No.
Okay.
I think that how it works, and this actually, to my mind, contributes to the exaggeration and to the degree of fabrication that they go to. I think that, and this is just my kind of understanding from reading about it, I don't know anything specific, but that, and from talking to people who work in Russian media, that there's a kind of general directive for politically sensitive topics of how to interpret it. And then all the local editors and TV producers kind of go out of their way to fulfill that mission. And a lot of times they overshoot it. And there's stuff that we have in the film that's been post factum scrubbed from the internet, including some like very offensive racist things, because they realize that, that they overstepped the line. So I think that's the way that it works, that there's a general directive and the channels are nominally, not Russia One, but other ones are nominally privately owned and stuff like that, but they follow the party line when covering. And then a lot of other channels that used to do politics were basically pushed out of political coverage. They were allowed to continue existing, but they just didn't do
multiple different pressures just disincentivize them.
Yeah. So we were just gathering hundreds of hours, and then we were looking for people on YouTube that would film themselves with their television.
And were you able to do that gathering from the U.S.?
Yes. We were all just sitting in Brooklyn. We had about 7 or 8 people, everyone editing, assembling, gathering, and just assembling this massive archive of disinformation, of every kind of falsehood along the way that was perpetrated. And it was fascinating because we were doing this, in the spring, and most of the investigation and the first investigation results kind of started coming out in the fall. So it was really kind of terra incognita, and especially with finding where the fake news lived on the internet and the way that it traveled was really fascinating. And so yes, we had this selection criteria where it had to be, where we wanted it to be all news footage or information TV, but wanted to have false statements. And then we wanted to have that false statement, see if there were people on the internet that took it up and re-released it into the world and kind of regurgitated. And specifically, we were looking for the way that people's thinking is infected by this. So there's this boy that congratulates Trump, and he's sitting somewhere in, I imagine, Siberia, where it's minus 27 degrees. And he congratulates him, and then he goes, "You have once again proven that a woman cannot become president." And he's about 11 or 12 years old, right? And it's horrifying because that's infested his reasoning abilities. And that's the real danger of all of this. And that's, why we wanted to make a movie that was, in a sense, so tough to take, because to understand that this is what this creates, and it's this kind of reality. And yeah, it's funny for a while, but then it kind of becomes horrifying. Precisely right. And so we were all just kind of gathering around and looking for these moments that could be revealing in these kinds of ways. And yeah, we have thousands of hours in this huge database. I can never say exactly how many hours because, a lot of these news shows, it will be like a 2-hour show on a weekly basis, but only, let's say, 15 minutes of that will be about America. So it's always hard to count.
So as I wrap this up, I want to ask you about the conversation going on now about Russia and Trump and collusion. There are journalists out there who say we're spending too much time thinking about Russia to the extent of ignoring other things that we should be paying more attention to about Trump. What's your perception?
My perception is that in the current debate, and I mean, in a way, this was the reason for making this movie, is that in the current debate, we're not looking enough at what's structurally happening with our media. And we are talking about fake news, but the way that the Russian influence on that and on this kind of disorienting, in creating this kind of disorienting atmosphere is, I think, not being grappled with enough. And one way in which it's not being grappled with is, and this is a personal question that I have, so that I don't exactly, but this film is sort of an investigation of, is what do we make of the fact that someone like RT self-applies the term propaganda? But they don't run from it, they don't deny it exactly, sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. But they, there's a shot in the film, it was one of the few shots that I actually filmed, and it's at the Moscow airport, and it's a billboard for RT that says, keep watching to find out who we're going to hack next. Beware, a propaganda bulwark is at work. And I think that there's a move there that's really, it's sort of profound, but we haven't figured out what to do with that. When people will openly own the fact that this is biased or manipulative, but then tar everyone else with the same brush. So what do you do? Because obviously any demarcation, and this is what's being discussed with having RT being classified as a propaganda outlet, right? Well, what does that achieve? Because it also gives much more leverage to Putin to point out the double standards involved in the West, and then to identify the BBC and the New York Times as propaganda, and have them register in Russia and do all these things. So I think that to me is the big unknown cloud that we should be grappling with a bit more to get clarity on these central issues about collusion. I think that a lot of the debates, a lot of the conversations about collusion, I don't necessarily find that interesting, because they all seem to hinge on the legal definition of collusion, and Trump or anyone in his party have no ideas about any of those definitions. So it's a little bit of a kind of apples and oranges scenario. So that's my general of having consumed an absurd amount of fake news in the last year and sat with this material and looked at the way that it worked, that I think that the well of figuring out how many kind of Twitter bots and how many people, how many users were reached, I think that we've kind of exhausted that well numerically, and ultimately they're not going to tell us that much. We're not going to be able to figure out what percentile, how much that swung Michigan or anything like that. But what we haven't talked about is precisely the more profound corrosive effect that this has on our whole infosphere.
I want to thank Maxim Pozdorovkin for speaking with me. You can watch the short version of Our New President at fieldofvision.org. The longer version will play at New York's Rooftop Films on August 9th and be released later this year. Pussy Riot, A Punk Prayer, is available on iTunes and other platforms. Thanks to our team. Series producer, Sarah Moto. Our Miami-based sound recordist, Khalil Bailey. Sound mixer, Tom Micah. And web designer, Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOMPowers. I invite you to listen to our short-form podcast, Documentary of the Week, from WNYC. You'll find over 170 documentary recommendations. Pure Nonfiction is distributed by the TIFF Podcast Network. You can read our show notes, learn about live events, and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.